Welcome to the Atlantic Council's discussion. I'm Jill Doherty, and I am honored and actually excited to be able to lead this conversation. Just for the record, I am adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service, and I'm also CNN's former Moscow bureau chief. You know, there is a lot of discussion right now reporting about negotiations to reach at least a ceasefire, if not a full peace agreement in the Ukraine war. Most of it deals with discussions at the White House, with Ukrainian President Zelensky, and with our European allies. But today we're going to take a slightly different approach, and that is to focus on how Russia views negotiations with Trump and Ukraine. And we have three real experts to discuss this. Dr. Leon Aron. And Dr. Aron is a Russian-born historian, biographer, and expert on Russian politics, known for his deep analysis of post-Soviet Russia. He is the author of several acclaimed books, including Riding the Tiger, Vladimir Putin's Russia and the Uses of War, that was 2024, and Yeltsin, A Revolutionary Life. Then we have a person many people know, John Herbst. Ambassador Herbst is the senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and he is also the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and to Uzbekistan. Over his 31-year diplomatic career, he's played key roles in strengthening U.S. relations in the Eurasia region. And then finally, Ilya Ponomaryov. He is a Russian politician, he's a tech entrepreneur, and a former member of the Russian parliament, 2007 to 2016. He is known for casting the sole vote against the 2014 annexation of Crimea. He now serves as Speaker of the Congress of People's Deputies, which is a shadow Russian parliament. And he's also the author, let me just change the view here because don't want to zoom quite that much. I was on 500%. He is the author of Does Putin Have to Die? Outlining a post-authoritarian view of Russia. So just a little housekeeping. We're going to be talking for roughly 45 minutes. And then we're going to open it up the remaining part of the hour, 15 minutes for questions from the audience. And a reminder, if you want to submit questions, and I'm sure a lot of you will, you can send them to askac.org. So ask Atlantic Council, ac.org. So onward here, I think I'm going to start with Ambassador Herbst, if I could. Mr. Ambassador, you know, when I was thinking about how do we approach this subject, I thought a very basic question that I think we have to answer is why did Putin agree to participate in these negotiations at all? Obviously, President Trump began this process, but why did Putin even jump on the bandwagon? You may have a little audio, I think.
Hello, you can't hear me?
There we go. It's better.
Okay.
Yep, we're okay.
Okay, I'll speak a little bit louder. I don't think he jumped on the bandwagon. I think he felt he had to do something to reduce the odds of Trump taking strong steps against Putin's war efforts. Trump's made pretty clear, even as a candidate, that he would try to achieve a durable peace between Ukraine and Russia. And he said, as a candidate, and after he returned to the Oval Office, that he thought if he thought Assad was blocking efforts to achieve a durable peace, he would come down hard on that side. And so starting in March, we've seen the Russians turn down one proposal after another from Trump, even as Ukrainians accepted them. And starting some point in late June, Trump's rhetoric grew. He began seriously to look at taking major economic steps against Russia, sanctions on not just Russia, but its principal trading partners. And he talked about sending advanced arms to Ukraine. And he set what seemed to be a fairly hard deadline of August 8th. And it's no surprise that when Special Envoy Witkoff showed up in Moscow on August 6th, few days before that deadline, Trump whispered sweet things in his ears, which Witkoff mistook for flexibility. And as part of that setup and then what followed, I think Putin's decided he cannot simply brush away negotiations. That's how we have this not quite serious effort from the Kremlin to negotiate.
Yeah, which does seem to be continuing, obviously. Leon, Aaron, let's turn to Putin because the focus is on Russia and Putin. What are Putin's goals in this?
Thank you, Jill, and thank you, John, for arranging this and having me. And again, very good to see you, Jill, after all those years on CNN and so on. Obviously, the short-term and mid-term goals are protean. You could manipulate that, especially if you have almost unlimited control over your mass media at home. But I think there are four constants that I think we should keep in mind in order to look at Putin's goals here. The first one is that his decision to invade Ukraine had nothing to do with NATO and everything with the EU, which is to say, he did not believe, and he still doesn't believe, despite everything he says, that there was a NATO danger emanating potentially from Ukraine. What he was afraid of, and actually what terrifies him, is a democratic, prosperous, eventually stable, and Western-oriented Ukraine compared to his atavistic, self-isolated petrostate dictatorship. The second goal is, or the second part of that framework in which I think we should look at Putin's goals, is that war is good for dictatorships. It is a goal in and of itself. Which is why dictatorships almost inevitably slide towards wars. When we look at Putin, 2022, in his 70th year of life and his 22nd year effectively in power, he needed to give a boost to militarized patriotism, which I think is the sole defining ideology and legitimacy of his regime. Third, and it pertains to our conversation, the conversation that you started with, John, about Trump and Putin. I think the problem with, or the reason for Trump's meandering is his inability to understand that Putin is not after peace, but after victory. And that victory is defined, again, if you have a control of mass media, you could do all sorts of things. But largely, I think it's defined as a neutered Ukraine. Ukraine demobilized, disarmed, its domestic and foreign policy dictated from the Kremlin. And of course, it kind of returned to the Yanukovych's 2014 regime, Ukraine as a Russian protectorate, call it Belarusiization of Ukraine. And finally, above and beyond these goals, I think there's an overarching objective. And that is, I called it revenge and recovery. Putin believes that the fall of the Soviet Union was a plot. It was a conspiracy by the West, aided by traitors and fools like Gorbachev and Yeltsin, but nevertheless largely pulled off by the West. Recovery is reacquiring for his Russia, at least in part, not territorially, but largely in terms of its weight in foreign affairs and global diplomacy, the status of Soviet superpower. And these two goals converge in what I think is still coming, unfortunately, and that is the testing of NATO, which Putin wants to expose as a paper tiger, as an alliance that has no purpose and is too timid to resent aggression, not just against Ukraine, but I'm afraid against perhaps a smaller state on NATO's eastern border, which is most likely to be Estonia and Latvia. So I think this is the framework in which we should look at Putin's goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. Ilya Panmaryov, Ilya, with your knowledge of domestic politics in Russia, take us now into what Putin wants in terms of the goal and either this big debate that we have right now, ceasefire or permanent settlement, because President Putin constantly says we have to have the root causes settled. So, what does he mean by that, and where is he going with this?
Thanks. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for having me here. And Jill, special thanks for you because you are the only Western person who knows how to pronounce my last name. It's like that's perfect. That's what takes years experience in Moscow. Yes. Anyway, so about Putin. First of all, I agree with what was already said here. I think that obviously this war is not about NATO or about some geopolitics. The root cause of this war is obviously Mr. Putin himself, and this war would not end before this thing would not be eradicated. He needs a victory. That's why he met with Witkoff on August 6th, and that's why he went to Alaska, and that's why he's negotiating, because he needs to claim some victory. Exactly because this war does not have any particular aim besides the victory itself, so it needs to be such a victory which could be sold to the society. It's not an objective thing. It's a very subjective thing. It's a PR thing. Society and Russian elites, they need to acknowledge the end of campaign in Ukraine as a victory. But that doesn't mean that's the end of the war. And when he is talking about, again, the root cause of the war, obviously he's talking about NATO and NATO expansion. And here I fully agree with Leon, who is saying that as soon as we have ceasefire or any kind of agreement in Ukraine, we will very soon face another act of aggression against Baltic states or Poland. Where I slightly disagree, I think that Lithuania and Poland is more likely than Latvia and Estonia, but it really doesn't matter because the whole thing is not about territory, it's not about a particular country, it's about testing Article 5, it's about creating a provocation which would require the nation which is under attack to call for Article 5, which would not be granted. And that's the end of NATO, and then it's a reconstruction of all the security layout of Europe, because then all the nations would have to do bilateral relations with Russia, bilateral security agreements to prevent any further aggression. That's what he wants. But right now, the objective is obviously Ukraine, and I think that he would be actually pretty flexible in Ukraine. I think that Witkoff did not mishear what he was told in Moscow. That could be obviously because, as we Russians say, I didn't hold the candle, but I am absolutely certain because I heard about the details of the proposition, and the details included how the land corridor would be secured, and they were talking about a concession for an American company, the same way as in Armenia, Zangezur corridor. So it was like, okay, Mr. Trump, you can offer your company to do this. So there was details which you cannot just like invent. Somebody had to say this to Mr. Witkoff, whether it was Putin himself, or whether it was Kirill Dmitriev, who is obviously part of this so-called system liberal elites in Russia, which want the war to end, and that's why they were trying to find the solution. But anyway, Witkoff was coming with a message, and that's why Alaska summit happened in the very first place, because Trump was sure that they would be able to negotiate this grand swap of land, and that's what he was talking about all the time in public.
Okay. Ambassador Herbst, let's go to the strategy, like how this actually is working out, Putin and Trump. So President Trump obviously has the art of the deal, and we're seeing some of it probably playing out right now in terms of how he, goes back and forth and, is happy, sad, angry, etc. But let's look at Putin. Does he have his own art of the deal? And is it working? Is the strategy of Putin working?
My view of Putin's objectives are very much like Leon and Ilya's. He wants what I say effective political control of Ukraine. So Putin has zero interest in a ceasefire. and zero interest in a peace agreement unless the Ukrainians accept his diktat terms, disarmament, neutrality, essentially being a state that can easily be poked in any direction that the Kremlin wants. And the Ukrainians are not going to accept that. So he wants the war, the fighting to continue. But he wants it to continue without serious American obstruction. In other words, serious American support for Ukraine. Trump, in my judgment, and I have a lot of colleagues who disagree, wants a durable peace. He doesn't want a peace which then Russia could come back and take more of the country. He wants a peace somewhere along the current lines controlled by the armies. But he wants it to be a secure peace. And he has made noises going back to May. Trump has made noises going back to May that maybe Putin's not serious about peace and maybe we have to bring a hammer down on Putin. And again, he spent 6 or so weeks leading up to August 8th preparing that hammer. And it may well be, as Ilya says, that what Witkoff reported was what he heard. But of course, whether or not that's true, Putin had no intention of pursuing whatever he may have told Witkoff, because he doesn't want to give Ukraine that measure of respect, that measure of territory. And he certainly does not want to cease fire without him running the show in some fashion in Ukraine. So he's entered into this process because Trump is pushing on it. He doesn't want Trump working against him. And thus far, he's managed neither to truly anger Trump, to bring the hammer down, or to actually have to make any concessions. He hasn't even made the process concession of agreeing to meet with Zelensky. And even his latest move in that direction suggests Zelensky has to come to Moscow, which is a non-starter for a whole host of reasons, starting with Zelensky's personal security. So this is Putin's game. He's played it thus far successfully. Even some Russian commentators will let out that secret. But he's also increasing the conception in Trump's own mind that he is being played. And it may be at a certain point that the time worn out for Putin, he either has to make a serious concession or Trump will actually bring American power pressure to bear.
But just to drill down 2 seconds here, what does Putin do to try to, influence or play Trump? What's the technique here?
We've seen it happen exactly the same way twice. I think it was the second weekend in May. You had Zelensky and Merz and Macron meeting, agreeing that if the Russians did not accept a ceasefire in a day or two, we're going to do major sanctions. They called President Trump, and they thought they had him on board. I remember the news came out that Sunday, and literally within 2 hours, Putin saying, "Why do we need this? I'll meet with Zelensky." Trump immediately dropped his interest in the sanctions. And then, of course, Putin dropped his interest in meeting Zelensky. So when this played out again between August 6th and August 8th, I was thinking Putin, a.k.a. Lucy, a.k.a. Putin, was picking up the football again. And Charlie Brown, a.k.a. Trump, was once again kicking at a ball that wasn't there. So it's worked for him twice. Although, again, I'm not confident this will go on ad infinitum, as it does in the comic strip.
Well, we can hope. Okay, so Leon, back to you. I'm very interested in the process because it doesn't get talked about quite as much as I think it should. Let's look at the negotiating teams. I mean, you have Lavrov, the foreign minister, and Mr. Ushakov, who is very experienced. In fact, I think I've heard that cumulatively, and it would have to be true, they have about 100 years of diplomatic experience between them. So we've got a pretty good team on the Russian side. So what about the American side? I mean, Mr. Witkoff, I guess, is good at real estate, but he does not speak Russian and he is not a diplomat. So just objectively, how do those teams stack up?
Jill, I feel this is almost a rhetorical question. You, I'm sure, met Ushakov, I met Ushakov. Regardless of whom he served, I think he's a consummate civil servant. extremely knowledgeable, regardless of his current position, as the advisor to somebody, which I think you agree with me, that when he was ambassador in the U.S., he would have been horrified by if we told him that this was going to be Russia's policy.
Yep.
Just to elaborate on what John said, and I agree with everything he said. You know, Lenin had an article in 1904 called "One Step Forward, Two Step Backwards." This is Putin's strategy. The one step forward is Alaska. One step forward is all those phone calls that he has with Trump. He promises a great deal, then he moves backwards. This is, and by the way, here's where Lavrov comes in. He is not advising Putin. Putin is advised by FSB, Foreign Intelligence, and Ushakov to a certain extent. They roll out Lavrov, who's essentially powerless, precisely to dress up two steps backwards, which of course he just did. Whatever Putin whispered in Trump's ear in Alaska, Lavrov just walked back. Most seriously and most damagingly, of course, the so-called the security guarantees to Ukraine. Which brings us, of course, to another member of the team, which you mentioned, and that's Steve Witkoff, who I think took 3 or 4 days, judging by public sources, to explain what it is that Putin actually told him, what it is that he promised, that he did not promise, what he hinted at. And this is an absolutely astounding lack of professionalism, or even, Jill, due diligence. I mean, this, you know, for summits, the protocol calls for an extensive briefing in terms of who you're meeting, what the issues are. As far as we know, none of that was there. What comes to mind, of course, is what was caught on the hot mic, Trump talking to Macron. You know, he said, Putin will do it for me. I really believe that. Anybody familiar with Putin's personal and professional history, beginning with the higher school of counterintelligence after Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov, would laugh at something like this. Putin is a professional liar. Putin knows how to manipulate. He's been taught this. He is very good at that. In any case, it appears that Trump goes to these negotiations without the team, contrary to what you said, or rather contrary to the question. He goes cold, he goes ad hoc, and here we have the results.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting discussion so far. And I want to remind the audience that we have an opportunity to ask questions, and we'll be looking at them, I guess, in about 20 minutes. So you send them to askac.org, askac.org. All right, onward. Ilya, you're going to bring us into, you know, the mind, maybe not the mind, but the techniques here. How important, picking up from what Leon was talking about, how important are face-to-face meetings that Mr. Putin would have with other world leaders? Now, of course, it's President Trump. And could you describe like the dynamics? What does he do in these personal meetings?
I think that's it's extremely important, face-to-face meetings, and I was always puzzled how you Americans always interact between each other on Zooms, on phones. You know, we don't do this way because we cannot manipulate this way. And personal chemistry is all about face-to-face meetings, and obviously Putin is a brilliant guy in this sense. I remember my personal meetings with him, and if I would not know who is standing in front of me, I would immediately believe that's my best friend. That's like my buddy, you know, which is closer and better understands me than my wife. He's extremely good, and always poor Mr. Witkoff. who is not that bad actually. To my mind, I think he is way better than Ushakov. Ushakov, I think, is one of the most useless foreign officers in Russia in general. At least my experience working with him as an ambassador in the US was that way. To the contrary from Lavrov and even Medinsky, by the way. Medinsky is a very smart guy. You know, he has awful beliefs and absolutely anti-historic beliefs in many senses. But as a technologist, as a thinker, he is definitely somebody interesting to talk with. But Witkov is just a businessman, and when I see American media, top-notch media, very high professional journalists eating him alive, grilling him, and all those interviews, I really feel sorry for him because he just doesn't know how to interact. I think that he is a pretty decent communicator, but nothing more than a communicator. He communicates what he has heard. And I think that Trump, who is very much a bird of the same feather in terms of his background, he is consciously using Witkov in this sense. He made this construct when Kellogg is a great messenger with Ukrainians. Witkov is a great messenger with Russians. But at the end of the day, the decisions and the judgment is being made by Trump himself. And here, obviously, it's a competition with Putin because they both believe that they are the smartest, that they are the centers of the world, that they are the alpha male, that they are superior, and they would outsmart each other. And what we see right now developing is this power struggle, and I think it would carry on for a while. Where I would rather debate with what my colleagues have said so far, I think that Putin at one point would be ready to make a tactical concession if he would be given a way to claim victory. And for him, the way to claim victory, primary, is to have certain territory fully occupied. And that's why I'm saying about Donbass, because at the very beginning, all the Russian propaganda, it was about that we are to liberate Russian people on Donbass, Russian language, like Ukraine was bombing Donbass for 8 years, all this nonsense. And with this, he actually can declare victory inside the country. Where I fully agree with what John and Leon was saying is that claiming this victory and making this concession doesn't mean that the war ends. It means that it goes into the next stage and no demobilization of army would happen and the regime would not change. The only way to stop the war is to change Putin. But nevertheless, this tactical negotiation may take place, and it also may take place to actually influence the internal situation in Ukraine, because for this referendum, for removing the martial law in Ukraine, and with a clear possibility to remove Zelensky through some presidential elections that he would demand. So there are a lot of constructs that can be built around that, but most importantly is that he cannot conquer this land militarily, and through negotiations, he thinks that he has a chance.
I want to get into a question, Ambassador Herbst. It's a little complicated, but it's one of the key issues, and we could do an entirely different session on that. And it's security versus territory. So just recently, I'm trying to think, it was a Russian official who said, there's no connection between those. There's no trade-off between security and territory. But I wonder if you could run us through, the demands that Putin is making on both of those issues. Territory, President Trump has called territorial swaps, and then also security, protecting the security of Ukraine. Obviously, Putin would say protecting the security of Russia. But can you run us through just briefly on some of that?
Sure. I'll start with your initial comment. The Russians will claim that there's no connection between the two because there's very specific demands on territory and on security. And you're right that when they talk about security, they mean first and foremost their security as they define it to justify their aggression in Ukraine. And here you come back to Leon's analysis in response to your first question. That's a pretext because their concerns are much more about Ukraine being an independent democratic state. Okay. It's the Ukrainians who talk about security and land being a trade-off, as do the Americans and other Westerners. Now, many people who talk about this issue say that there needs to be a just peace. And if you were talking about a just peace, that means Ukraine remains whole and intact, and all of occupied Ukraine returns to Russia. Returns to Ukraine from Russia.
Yes, sir.
Right. But Trump's never been talking about a just peace. He's been talking about a durable peace, a stable peace. And those two things are distinct. And while a durable peace should not be confused with a just peace, it can be at least an adequate or somewhat more than adequate outcome to the current fighting. And here's where you come to, in this quest for a durable peace, a trade-off between land and security. Trump's made clear as a candidate and since that the final lines of any deal he'd be associated with will look somewhat like the current front lines. You can have some swaps here or there, but basically that. But at least Trump's team, and then Trump himself, I think, have made clear they want, at the end of this understanding, this deal, this peace, this ceasefire, a Ukraine that is secure, that is economically viable, and that will exist as a normal state would. Zelensky has been talking about security guarantees since the first days of the big invasion, without any success in the West. But surprise, surprise, and actually I don't mean that mockingly, I mean that actually, we're now talking very seriously about security guarantees, including the Trump administration. Even before he took office, people around Trump talked about things that could serve to achieve a durable peace. They're the ones who mentioned European troops deployed to Ukraine. They're the ones who talked about arming Ukraine to the hilt. Now, these ideas are being discussed in a very serious way because one of the most important developments since roughly early March is the way the Europeans have begun to talk seriously and act seriously about putting troops into Ukraine. And Zelensky, even before Trump took office after our election, was making clear he understood there might be some need for territorial compromise on his part, provided security is taken care of. And if you compare the conversation in the Oval Office on February 28th with the conversations that began with the extraordinary summit of the 7 Europeans in the Oval Office on, August 22, and the conversation since, here you have Trump saying things that begin to meet Zelensky's needs. So this all works if we're talking about a durable peace. It doesn't work if we're talking about a Kremlin diktat to Ukraine and effective Kremlin control of the country. That's why the Russians say no connection here. But that connection is everything. Now, one last point, and I'll be a little bit discreet, only a little. There's some confusion in the administration on the issue of security guarantees. Now, I'm quite heartened by where the administration is today on this, because Trump has said publicly, okay, no American soldiers, but maybe American contract soldiers. 1. 2, Trump has said, yes, we can use American air power to make this happen and to reassure our European colleagues who would deploy. That's really great. But then you have an occasional comment here or there in Trump world, like, well, if the Russians don't agree to security guarantees, there can't be any. If the Russians say, no, European troops can't deploy, there can't be any. Comments like that are inconsistent with the direction that President Trump seems to be moving in his own idiosyncratic fashion. Mm-hmm. The positive things we're seeing coming from the president push back hard against that notion that somehow the aggressor gets to veto security guarantees for the victim. And somehow that aggressor has control over American foreign policy. No, That's not how it works when you are the undisputed superpower. At least that's not how it should work.
Mm. Wow. Well, that was a great summary, and it's very complex. Thank you. Let's see. I'm the timekeeper here, so we've got about 9 more minutes for our conversation. Then we're going to go to questions. And again, askac.org if you have a question. Leon, maybe we can. I have a few more questions. I have a million questions, but in this case, a few more. So maybe we can kind of keep it brief so we can get through them. This question, Leon, would be about Russia's friends and allies. So China, Iran, North Korea being the main ones. Where do they fit into all of this at this point? How does Putin use them, maybe exploit them? What would you say?
Jill, I think it's probably the other way around. Leaving behind or leaving outside the pariah states like North Korea and Iran, who, yes, are useful to Putin as suppliers of volunteers, as suppliers of drones, as suppliers of artillery shells, but in terms of geopolitics and prestige, probably slightly embarrassing to him. But the ones that we should talk about is China, of course, and most recently India. You remember that shot at the celebration of China in China of the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. The three of them are standing there holding hands. Very touching. So India is a very obvious case, and I don't think it's a very durable part of the alliance. It's there because of the snub by Trump largely. Modi, for obvious domestic political reasons, cannot be seen as taking it lying down. So there he is. And it's a traditional diplomatic trick. Okay, you don't like me, you abuse me. Well, there are others that I can join. It's a little bit more complicated and unfortunately durable with China. As we don't have much time, I'll just give 2 reasons. One, she sees the war there in terms of purely tactical terms as simply dividing NATO and the US particularly, dividing their attention from the South China Sea, the harassment of the Philippines, of course, the Taiwan Strait, because it could potentially, and probably is already in terms of the supply of weaponry, tie down NATO and the US in Eastern Europe instead of paying much more attention to China. At least this, I think, what she thinks. But the other reason which bothers me more, and which is not all mentioned, but I really looked at this and I spilled some ink on it. She is a devoted Marxist. He is a fervent Marxist. And what Marx tells him is that eventually democratic capitalism is doomed. That's the core of the so-called historical materialism. And remember, Marx famously said that the revolutionary force is the midwife of history. Well, but the midwife of a revolution is a war. And she knows very well, for example, that the birth of the Soviet Union, birth of Bolshevism in Russia, or rather the control and the installment of Bolshevik regime in Russia, was the result of World War I. World War II brought, of course, as we know, China, socialist China, and of course Eastern Europe and Central Europe as socialist states. Whether they were genuine or not is a different subject. So to she, the support of Putin is both tactical, which I explained, drawing the attention and the resources of the West, but also something that I think he firmly believes would result in, if not the end of democratic capitalism, but certainly a huge amount of damage, hollowing out, exposing, again, to quote myself, as a paper tiger. And that is how he's leveraging Russia.
In the interest of time, we have 5 minutes left, and I hate to do this, but I want to go back to Ambassador Herbst at the end of this. Ilya, if you forgive me, but I want to finish up because this is a big debate. And perhaps it's a little off the Putin focus, but there is this debate that some people would say, okay, President Trump is using, he thinks that if he finds a big enough carrot, that he will induce Putin to come to some type of peace. And then others say, no, you have to use a stick. But then there's no action. Sometimes he rhetorically uses a stick, but there's no action. And then finally, others would say, no, you need a club. Forget about a stick. We need Ukraine armed and striking back at Russia itself. So I'm going to ask you in these remaining minutes to try to put that together. And with your experience, what do you think now dealing with Putin that President Trump should do?
I think most people know that I'm a strong advocate that when your adversary, and Putin's Russia is definitely our adversary, is not uninterested in peace in Ukraine, and you're trying to persuade him to make peace in Ukraine, the only tools you really have are, for the short run, sticks. And I agree, it's not just sticks, but a club. And I believe that we've seen 4+ months of kisses and chocolates as the approach of the administration towards the Kremlin, and that has not worked. The kisses and clubs have been about this amazing economic cooperation, about even people in Trump's milieu floating the idea of allowing Russian gas and oil back into the European market, which directly contradicts Trump's own interest in drill, baby, drill, and exporting like crazy from the United States. And all of these things have not yielded one concession, one actual compromise from the Kremlin. I think it's safe to say that Putin believes, and his inner circle believe, that they can manipulate this administration the way they have every other major Western leader since Russia's revisionist campaign began with the war on Georgia. But I think they'll probably be proved wrong. We've had now several months of concessions to the Russians as a way to persuade them and gotten nothing. When Trump has actually seemed to be on the verge of movement, Putin acted in the 2 examples that I mentioned. But since that action was enough to stay Trump's hand, Putin achieved his objective. So you really want to test this out, put major pressure on the Kremlin. And I can tell you this, if Trump does what I consider to be the right thing, it's not going to be a matter of 1 month or 2 months or 3 months before we see the results. Putin and his team will assume they can simply outwait this latest tantrum, quotation marks. And we have to be willing to put this pressure on for many, many months to see if it actually can work. And even if it's not working initially, it's going to make it harder for Putin to sustain the war. And that in itself is a huge plus. Leon, Ilya are right that if Putin wins in Ukraine, he's going to do other things. The smart place to stop this revisionist actor willing to commit aggression to achieve his goals is in this large country with an extraordinarily able fighting population, which only needs our economic and military support, not our lives, not our soldiers. It's a no-brainer for anyone who can see the world straight. And if you believe that China is our greater adversary, which I believe, she is watching closely what we do in Ukraine. That's why the leaders of Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, you want to stop Xi in Taiwan, make sure Putin loses in Ukraine. Would that the geniuses in the American foreign policy world who say Asia, 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 understood what the leaders of South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan understand.
All right. Well, fantastic. So, okay, so now we're going to go to questions, and there actually are quite a few. So we will jump right in. The first one comes from Jack Howe. Regardless of whether a ceasefire and negotiations actually proceed, is there actually any scenario in which Putin can be trusted not to restart hostilities? Ilya, I will give that to you.
No. It's very simple.
That is
No, because why? it's a great chance to elaborate on what I wanted to say, what John was saying about the security guarantees. It's so important for Ukrainians, and it takes so much time and so much effort in all the negotiations, this question of security guarantees. But to my mind, the security guarantees just do not exist. They cannot exist in theory. Because the best security guarantee so far in the world was Article 5 of NATO. And in Moscow, people are absolutely certain that the Article 5 would not work if they would attack Baltic states. And that means that it's not a security guarantee. It's a retaliation act, maybe if it would be invoked at the end of the day, but it's not a security guarantee because it would not serve the purpose. It would not prevent Russia from attacking Baltic states. And that means that even if Ukraine is a part of NATO and is protected under Article 5, still nobody in Moscow would believe that this Article 5 would actually be used in the case of attack. And that's why I do not see what kind of security guarantee can in generally be in place, if we are not keeping Alina Kabayeva hostage in the cellar of the White House. So it's not a question of a stick or even a baseball bat. It's a question that while this political system in Russia is in place, it would continue fighting because the logic of the system, which is constantly tightening the screws, is to increase the heat, increase the pressure, start new conflicts, and by this survive. It's a matter of their survival, and that's why they would continue.
Okay, so this is a good question. Next one. What is the actual state of Russia's military and economy? Some analysts suggest Russia is not ready to negotiate unless it loses on the battlefield or its economy is crippled, despite some declines in oil revenue. That's from Anna Riceland. And I think we'll go to Leon for that.
Yes, thanks very much. The only way to stop this war is to defund Russia. And to defund Russia, you have to somehow reduce its major lifeline, which is 30% of its budget that comes from the sales of oil. You could impose sanctions. Unfortunately, India is not enough. You have to deal with China on this, and that's very problematic. Your questioner is exactly right. Russia is on the verge of, if not recession, but it's definitely in stagflation. The inflation continues to be very high, especially for the products, potatoes and eggs and chicken, as you know, that don't fit in the overall, 9.5%, but have been increasing by orders of magnitude for the population that's essentially Putin's voting bloc. So he's watching this very carefully at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum this past summer. Both Elvira Nabiullina, who is the chairman of the State Bank, Central Bank, and some other, including economic ministers, said that the civil economy is exhausted. Both the resources, human resources, and investments are all in the military sector. This is a very dangerous game. And Putin has about $30 billion left out of an enormous amount in the Fund of National Welfare. He keeps dipping into it because nobody would buy his debt, not even his Chinese friends without limits. So I will not go into other details, which do exist very much so, of Russia's rather dangerous economic situation now. It's not in recession yet, but it could be bordering on this. And so sanctions, exactly like John and Ilya pointed out, sanctions over a period of months, maybe years, may persuade Putin that the cost of peace is less than the cost of war, but you would need a lot of determined and cohesive action by the West.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Ambassador Herbst, I think this is a good one for you. It comes from Kate Winston. Why do you think Trump is holding Congress back in passing Senator Lindsey Graham's sanctions/tariff legislation? What do you think Trump meant when he said that after imposing tariffs on India, he still has phases 2 and 3 of pressure on Russia waiting in the wings? What would that pressure be?
First on the Graham bill or the Graham-Blumenthal bill, Trump does not want there to be other actors calling the shots on policy towards this war, policy towards Russia. So it was clear for months, going back to, I think it was March when Graham started this, that he saw this as a useful way for there to be a little bit of pressure to hopefully move Putin in the right direction. But he wanted to control it. So that's why he wants to keep his hands on the lever. And as for what Trump could do, I think we've seen some of those ideas already, and they're public. I mean, obviously, tariffs are a very blunt weapon in this circumstance. But you could also talk about going after those Russian banks that have not been sanctioned, applying the SWIFT sanctions to those banks. You could talk about going after certainly tripling down, not just doubling down, on the efforts that began late Biden administration against the Russian ghost fleet of oil tankers. And again, pressure on the trading partners. Now, Leon's right that China is a more difficult nut than India because of the leverage we have leverage on China's economy, they have leverage on our economy. So that gets harder to do. But if you tighten up virtually everything else, even leaving China more or less doing what it's doing, that would be substantial new problems for the Russian economy. And again, it's not just the economy. Arming Ukraine in ways that make it less likely that Russia can gain even those few millimeters it gains every day or more as it continues its kamikaze assaults on fixed Ukrainian positions. Something else we should be doing, not just to make sure the war comes out right, but to improve our own overall defense capability. The United States has been rather laggard in working with Ukraine on drones. The Brits, the Norwegians, and other Europeans have been doing a lot of stuff, and we're still dawdling. I don't understand that. That's just bad thinking amongst our defense industry planners. But this is something we should be doing. It would help on the war. Ukraine has the ability to produce far more of their first-class drones, top-of-the-line drones. They need investors. And America's been slow to participate there.
Okay. Leon Aaron, I think we've got a question for you. Given that one of Putin's goals is to challenge NATO's Article 5 and fracture the Western alliance from within, how do you think Putin will react to U.S. and Europe's attempts to strengthen deterrence against such Russian aggressions? It's an anonymous question. I don't know.
Well, it's a cost-benefit analysis by Putin. He is a driven man, but he's not a madman. And I think he could still make rational calculations. I've written about Estonia and Latvia for the past almost 10 years. I have a chapter in my latest book about this. I think that these are the most vulnerable places for Putin to test NATO. There was and there is a kind of a snail pace strengthening of defenses in both in the Baltics, which kind of started not after the 2014 occupation of Crimea, but after 2022, the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. But still, if you talk to Latvian and Estonian politicians, if you talk to their security people, it's woefully inadequate. Whereas before we had a rotating NATO companies with no tanks, no artillery, no or very few of those, and no air force. Yes, those are there, but we probably have about a division. I'll be very surprised. I stopped following it in the last few months, but the last time I checked, there was a NATO division facing the Western military district of Russia, which Putin recreated after the Soviet days. It was abolished by Yeltsin. And in terms of the sheer relation of power, Russia would go in one of those countries. And it's not going to go to Tallinn or Riga. It's going to seize the border areas, which are actually heavily ethnic Russian. So they could provoke riots or something like Donbass, which is not that difficult, regardless of the views of the population itself. They can always send a few provocateurs. And then they'll challenge, I think, NATO, as Ambassador was said here, to implement Article 5, with an understanding that that could lead to a nuclear war. So this is a pretty horrific scenario, but I'm not excluding it. I don't think, to answer directly the question that was asked, I don't think that Putin at this point feels that the deterrence that NATO has now in those countries is sufficient enough to prevent this kind of testing of NATO.
Mm. I wanted to jump very quickly just to Ilya for one kind of Russian question. When we get to decision making in Russia, it's usually, and I think Ambassador Herbst referred to this, it's basically Putin making the decisions, perhaps with the FSB and security, intelligence, et cetera. But in the negotiations with Trump, is that the same lineup? I guess my question is, what percentage of that strategy of dealing with Trump actually comes from Putin himself?
Actually, I think that in case of dealing with Trump, it's more than with day-to-day decisions on the economy, on social issues, or even on the work things. In general, Putin tends to control tighter the foreign policy because he thinks that he is the great guru there, and it's all about psychology, and he really is a mastermind in the psychology. But in the Trump case, it's even more. It's a question of his self-esteem. So he's the great guy. He cannot share this with no one. It's him who is supposed to make the decision. But he is influenced nonetheless, because on the war thing. In general, the structure inside the country is like he's the spider in the center of the web. He is not just the big unilateral dictator like Stalin or Hitler who can enforce his decisions on everybody else. He is the balancer. He is the top arbiter. He is the leader of the pack. But he has to listen to other people, and other people, they don't dare to contradict him directly. But nonetheless, they're trying to influence him and to steer him in a certain direction. And if you mentioned in the summer, actually the economy reports by the Russian officials, the government officials, were actually more grim. They were worse than the actual state of the economy. They were saying that it's already in the recession, while it's not in the recession. It's in the stagflation stage. It's 1% growth, but nevertheless it's the growth. But they were saying that it's already in the decline. Why is that? Because they're trying to persuade Putin to stop this bloody war, because they are tired of this. They are not happy with this, but nobody dares to say to him directly that, big guy, let's stop it, daddy, do something about this. They cannot do it, but they can persuade him, and that's what they are trying to do, so I wouldn't underestimate this. But with Trump, it's only Putin himself, only personal decisions, and only psychology.
All right. Well, on that, we're going to have to end. Unfortunately, we are exactly at the end of the hour. I want to thank very much our guests, Leon Aron, Ilya Ponomaryov, and Ambassador John Herbst. And thank you to the audience. There were great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but come back, because obviously there are a lot of Atlanta Council events. And thank you very much for participating.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.